So I took the train up and I landed at Princeton Junction, and it was a beautiful spring day, and there were lots and lots of Princeton undergraduates sunbathing on this nice expanse of green lawn, smiling. And I looked at them and I thought, there's something really strange about this picture. It was sort of unnerving. It was, has there been an alien visitation, and are these pod people? They were all beautiful and, really healthy and so on. But what really struck me was that they all had very straight teeth. And straightened teeth that they hit. It looked like everybody had been to an orthodontist. And of course, I had had orthodontia as a child because my father had very crooked teeth, and I inherited very crooked teeth, and I had exactly the same orthodontist he did, and he showed me my father's plastic models of his teeth from my father's childhood and matched them against mine, and they were exactly the same, and then he put on braces and so on and so on. So there I was, lecturing to these Princeton undergraduates with all of us having these extraordinary teeth. And I got interested in the history of the profession of orthodontia. And the question that drove it was, how did the orthodontist, if you're fixing a underbite or an overbite or whatever, how does the orthodontist know when to stop? What counts as a correct bite? Because that's an historically very molten matter. It depends on how you use your teeth. People who use their teeth to process leather or chew a different kind of food or many other things are going to have very different shaped jaw. And then there are also the genetic screw-ups, like my father's and mine, with teeth all over the place, and, getting fixed. So I found this wonderful physical anthropologist named Lauren Brace, who had written a paper about the history of orthodontia. And, a group of dental specialists that consolidate into their own profession in the late 19th century, which is exactly the period when a lot of the differentiation of medicine is happening into separate bodies of specialists, so on. This was very familiar. Remember, I was an historian of biology in those days. But what Lauren Brace was also interested in was how the orthodontist knew when to stop if they're correcting a bite. And what he argued was that in the evolutionary bioanthropology of the late 19th century and well into the late 20th century, the sort of progression from the big-jawed pre-Homo sapiens and then on through the races of man, the fundamentally racist, racialized picture, that the orthodontia organized itself around the correct facial angle, right? Straight out of racial anthropology of the 19th century. And the correct bite was derived from a population that has never lived on planet Earth except in sculpture. The correct facial angle is the facial angle of the statues of Greek gods. I grew up in a family where storytelling was part of the air we breathed and a big part of what happened around the dinner table. It was a family that loved words and loved language, not an intellectual family, not a family of scholars at all, but a family full of laughter and full of the vitality of sharing stories, especially at dinner time. And there was an anchor to that. And the anchor really was my father, who was a sports writer. He worked for the Denver Post for more than 50 years in the sports department, writing game stories for baseball, basketball, football, hockey, covered the Kentucky Derby sometimes, so forth. And Dad loved to write the game stories. He didn't want to be one of the columnists. He didn't want to do the muckraking, to dig up the dirt on corporate big-time sports. He wanted to write about the drama of the game. And I think that's something that he brought with him into his adult life from childhood. My father contracted tuberculosis as a very young child, and it was tuberculosis in his bones, not in his lungs, and particularly in the bones of his hips and his upper legs and his knees. It was very serious, and it kept him in a full-length body cast from just at his chest level down to his knees for 3 years, immobilized and in significant pain. There was no really good treatment for tuberculosis in those days. And he was blessed with parents and friends and a neighborhood full of kids and folks who made his life very full. My dad was not an intellectual, neither was my mother. The family had a love of words and a love of stories, but not in they weren't critics, they weren't particularly political. Insofar as they were political, I try to forget what they thought. Sort of an embarrassing part of one's childhood. On the one hand, there was Cardinal Spellman and the fascist Catholic scene of the 1950s in Irish Catholic Denver. I try to forget the political scene, basically. But the love of story, I don't forget. I think that, my father was a tremendously positive presence. His sense of storytelling was a kind of making live for an audience what made something vital. I also think I inherited a strong love of storytelling from growing up Catholic. There's no way you grow up Catholic as the serious little girl I was, with a profound immersion in the liturgy, in the colors, in the symbols, in the rituals, in the incense, in the dressing up, and I wanted to lead a children's crusade to the Holy Land, for Christ's sake. This is really bad. In today's world, to remember that as a 7-year-old girl, I wanted to lead a crusade is, less said the better. Except that it also helps me remember how deeply rooted Christian culture is in this thing we call the West, and how profoundly Islamophobic it is, and that in some way, I inherited that without even knowing that I was inheriting that. What I thought I was inheriting was the drama of a little girl leading other children into battle for truth or some other weird fantasy. No wonder I liked Fellini when I started going to real movies. I think I want to say, it doesn't look maybe at first glance that this beautiful Navajo basket, which of course I have no right to own, one of the reasons I hold it up here is because it's also embarrassing. How is it that a daughter of conquest owns this object? I just sort of leave that there as a question. There's no way that we can touch without inheriting the whole thing. It's not that I feel guilty with holding this basket, but the basket is also this eruption of the whole story of dispossession and of dependent sovereignty of Native American peoples, of the pricing apparatus for selling amazing Navajo rugs as if it were raw wool for decades, that kept Navajo weaving families in bondage to the trading stores in exchange for flour and sugar. And I can't not know who I am in the American West. I also can't know who I am. I can't forget who I am in the American West when I hear on the soundtrack my now old dog, my dog with whom I played agility, an Australian Shepherd, a herding dog, a dog who herded sheep on the conquest ranches of the American West. That her heritage and my heritage are both white in this, not as a color, but exactly, but as an apparatus. And what she's doing now is canine cognitive dysfunction. She's a little bit senile. And she starts barking in a little bit of confusion in the late afternoon. She doesn't exactly quite know what to do with herself. And what I hear is my old friend a little bit confused. And the barking, like the basket, reminds me of the detail, the intimacy of inheritance. That's the inheritance of big things and little things, the different lifespans of a woman and a dog, that we both flamed together for 10 years. And that she's old in a way I'm not yet. And my obligation is to accompany my friend, to that the kind of companion species as accompanying with each other through now this time, which includes mental confusion a little bit for my dog. So since she's right here and looking for a little bit of comfort, it lets me go back to that other part of storytelling. So that, let me say something else. It has been considered improper to be interrupted. Hey, you. Cayenne, hey, I think I'm gonna ask Rustin to come get you. I am. I'm gonna ask Rustin to come. Yeah, I think she needs Rustin. So I'm gonna ask my buddy to come get her. Rustin? Rustin? What's going on here?
Are you an animal or a person? I'm animal gorilla. The words we just heard were spoken by the gorilla Koko to the human being Penny Patterson. Let's look at those words from the point of view of the way a world looks to a culture critic. And let's take culture apart like these balls of yarn. First, I'd like to explain the principle that I use in looking at the production of modern culture. Seems to me the cultural critic is faced by a world that looks very much like tangled balls of yarn. And that one way to approach the situation is to pull on a thread and begin to untangle the ball of meanings and begin to trace through one thread and then another what gets to count as nature, for whom and when, and how much it costs to produce nature at a particular moment in history for a particular group of people.
Another way to imagine the same situation is to take a layer cake, Pepperidge Farm layer cake, formerly boycotted because of the Nestle bottle feeding scandal, to take a layer cake and cut into history as if it were a layer cake and begin to unpack the layers of meanings. Okay. Unpack the layers of meanings of all of the pleasures and all of the
problems that these layers of meanings produce for the historian and the culture critic. So let's go back to Penny Patterson and Koko and the problem of the talking gorillas
That part
and
upset
talking
my father.
chimpanzees in the first world in this mythic time called
the late 20th century. And let's do it by looking at some covers of the National Geographic magazine that presented Koko to an American public in the 1970s. The first cover of a National Geographic magazine we see is Koko the gorilla taking a picture of herself in the mirror with a Japanese camera. And what we see is the gorilla with the attribute of self-reflection, self-vision. The gorilla with a Japanese tourist camera sees herself in the mirror and takes her own picture. She's in charge of her own image. She represents universal man. The next picture we see in the National Geographic magazine is Koko the gorilla with the kitten in her arms. Koko herself with a pet. Koko again is universal man who names the animals.
So I am literally physically surrounded by, two, not huge, but, up to the ceiling, down to the floor, bookshelves full of science fiction books that Rustin and I have read and collected over the years out of our pleasures. It's very idiosyncratic. It isn't any effort to, take up the history of science fiction or anything of the kind, but they're books that we have read and loved and that our friends have read and loved. And I think, for me, a classic writer like Robert Heinlein, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, is something I read very late in the process. I didn't know Heinlein as a teenager, or didn't do any science fiction reading as a teenager. And my good friend and former student Katie King, who's always loved Heinlein and who really knew science fiction both as a kid and later, teaches me. And I was really introduced to science fiction through my friends, which is kind of true for all my ideas. I feel like everything I think I was introduced to by networks of friends. But the science fiction writers, the books that really mattered and still matter, are books by Joanna Russ, Picnic on Paradise, The Female Man, especially. An older generation of writers, Naomi Mitchison, Memoirs of a Spacewoman. These are feminist science fiction writers, feminist theorists of two quite different generations, both of whom are read by women's liberation people of the 70s. And these books make a huge impact on us. Joanna Russ also did this amazing book called How to Suppress Women's Writing. And the cover, she didn't write it, but it's clear that she did the deed. She wrote it, but she shouldn't have. She wrote it, but look what she wrote about it. She wrote it, but she only wrote one of it. She wrote it, but she really isn't an artist and it isn't really art. She wrote it, but she had help. She wrote it, but she's an anomaly. She wrote it, but. The way that women's writing was always sort of explained away. She wrote it, but it's not really first-class literature. She wrote it, but it's all very derivative. She wrote it, but it must have come from Nietzsche and Deleuze. She wrote it, but. I began writing here, right here, in this physical place, while Rustin and Jay and Bob and Nick and I were still building the house around it. And we had electricity, and I had an old Hewlett-Packard 86 machine and an old daisy wheel printer. Clunk, clunk, really huge. Offloading it to the dump later was a problem. I was working, helping with the construction, building the gardens, building the house, and writing at the same time. In the summers, because I was teaching in the rest of the year, and I'm not capable of writing sustained work when I'm also teaching, because teaching is all-consuming. It takes the best you've got, takes everything you've got. And you might be able to write something short, but I've never been able to write. And I stopped applying for grants a long time ago because the process was so alienating. And I made enough money that I could fund an occasional period off. I had a salary. And we would, so I felt like my research is not expensive. I don't need a laboratory. So I just stopped writing grant proposals and wrote during the summer and stole time and wrote here. And I'm surrounded by beauty. I'm surrounded by redwood trees. I'm surrounded by a beautiful creek, by friends and lovers and family. And I'm surrounded by books, and I have a really fabulous, this one is an old computer because I'm not doing my current writing here. But, we had a really pretty seriously working computer system before we had a telephone. We set up our computers before we paid attention to any of the other electricity needs, working digitally. Rustin and Nick are both software designers working, to do really neat contract design work, software tool design for various companies and whatnot. The savvy about working about digital worlds was part of my network of friends, and this space then became a really good place to write. And I wrote Primate Visions here. I wrote most of the Cyborg Manifesto here. It's not like it didn't, its origins aren't here. The writing is here. The writing process was here because it could be a rhythm between physical labor and writing and a whole lot of good food. Because we're all cooks, and we invested in, and besides computers, we invested in a really good cooktop and a really good convection oven early on. And our refrigerator was still up in the redwood trees covered by a piece of plywood.
Amor mío, por favor, tú no te vas. Yo contaré a las horas. Ven allá. Amor mío, por favor, tú no te vas.
Next slide.
Welcome to California Bird Talk. I'm Rustin Hogness. This year, we've been trying to learn to hear birds better. Today, we'll listen to two very different songs of a song sparrow, recorded by Chris Tenney in the Los Padres National Forest. I'll play a couple of variations of each song at normal speed, then slow down one of the variations by 8 times to let us discriminate what bird ears can hear at faster speeds. Here's the first song. Now slowed down. The second song. Slowed. It's a wonderful world of sound out there. Enjoy it. For California Bird Talk, this is Rustin Hogness.
Cat's Cradle is not just a game of string figures, but is a model for thinking, a model for storytelling. It's a working practice for me. And Vincent Desprez, Isabelle Stengers, and Bruno Latour and I play this game together in many ways. It's because I think we have a kind of love for each other's thinking and a deep kind of need for each other's relays of these figures. How it is that science fiction writing and science fiction writers become not illustrations of arguments or illustrations of thinking, but the thinking itself. How the science fiction it goes through a kind of a metamorphosis, a kind of transmogrification, transmutation, and is the theoretical practice. And women have repeatedly understood that not being disappeared by the powerful apparatus of masculinist thinking, of masculinist practices, both in institutions and at the level of individual people, that our thinking is disappeared fast. And I think one of the feminist practices by Le Guin, by Isabelle, by me, by Vinciane, we're still trying to teach Bruno to do this. He's getting a little better. No, but I'm joking about it. But one of the feminist practices is deliberately and carefully to be very precise about the history of ideas and the particular creativity and originality and importance of other women's thinking. I know myself from my own experience and from powerful women I know that the speed with which we disappear from the citation apparatuses is breathtaking. So later this week, we'll talk about the Camille stories that you and I and Vincent are trying to tell together. And they're stories of the children of compost, the children of the soil, of the underground, of the dark, of the night, of incapacity, of non-action, of non-success, not as a bad thing, but as that soil within which human souls, and perhaps not just human souls, are made. So the science fiction writers who write about these matters all the time, who tell their stories in these worldings, are, in my view, in the strict sense, philosophical texts. So I don't feel like I am importing them in order to do some other kind of work, much less using them to illustrate one of my points. But the stories that they tell, the storytellers, are, in my view, thinking. And thinking is what we need to do, not the discipline of philosophy or political economy or biology or literature or the disciplines will take care of themselves without my help. It's not like everything that happens in the disciplines is bad, far from it. But thinking is what we are about, and thinking is a materialist practice with other thinkers. And some of the best thinking is done as storytelling.
Fat and docile, big and dumb, they look so stupid, they aren't much fun. Cows aren't fun. They eat to grow, grow to die, die to be et at the hamburger fry. Cows well done. Nobody thunk it, nobody knew. No one imagined the great cow guru. Cows are one. He hid in the forest, read books with great zeal. He loved Che Guevara, a revolutionary veal. Cow say tongue. He spoke about justice, but nobody stirred. He felt like an outcast, alone in the herd. Cow doll drums. He moved, we must fight, escape or we'll die. Cows gathered around, 'cause the stakes were so high. Bad cow pun. But then he was captured, stuffed into a crate, loaded onto a truck where he rode to his fate. Cows are bummed. He was a scrawny calf who looked rather woozy. No one suspected he was packing an Uzi. Cows with guns. They came with a needle to stick in his thigh. He kicked for the groin. He pissed in their eye. Cow well hung. Knocked over a tractor and ran for the door. 6 gallons of gas flowed out on the floor. Run, cows, run. He picked up a bullhorn and jumped up on the hay. We are free-roving bovines. We run free today.
First of all is a quotation of me. So we can get rid of this rather quickly, although of course it's a quotation of me in French, which I like, because I of course wrote it in English and Isabelle translated it into French, and now I read it in French in order to speak about it in English, which is exactly a cat-cradle game in and of itself. Nous avons besoin de nouveaux types de récits. We need other kinds of stories. We must change the story. The stories of the earth, we must change the deadly story. The story of the first beautiful words and weapons, the story of the killing, the story of achievement as the achievement of second birthing, that is, killing. The great existentialist philosopher Sartre, who argues that it is in second birthing that we become human. First birthing is merely birthing, the birthing of women, the birthing of the earth, the birthing in the soil. It is in second birthing, in the achievement of self-made, in the following through tragically of self-realized purpose, of coming of that kind of tragic consciousness that is human consciousness. That is second birthing, usually through some kind of killing. If ever there was nonsense of an extraordinary kind, and a nonsense that has ruled storytelling, Sartre only concretized and distilled what is a very old set of commitments, not just beliefs, but commitments. And we, all of us, in this time where the ongoingness of the life as we know it, where Gaia is intruding, where the intrusion of that which will no longer be put down threatens ways of life as usual. It doesn't threaten life itself. Life itself will go on for as long as this planet has the right conditions of temperature and moisture and whatever. For microbes are very inventive. It's not like life itself is at stake, but vast ways of life and becoming with each other across peoples and species on this earth are truly at stake. And the rate of extinction of ways of life, ways of living and dying, of peoples of all species, including human, are truly on the ledge, on the edge of falling off into nothingness. The story of the earth is at stake as we participate in it. Our own extinction is, of course, truly possible. But with or without extinction, in terms of the kind of final death, the deepening of the destruction of ways of living and dying on this earth is happening. And the story of this earth, the arts of living on a damaged planet, Anna Tsing's term, the absolute obligation to become capable, to render each other capable of changing the story, a story of ongoingness cultivated in the earth, in the tunnels of the earth. If the makers of living and dying on this earth could begin to somehow be at risk to each other, to propose something real, to make a proposition in a sense that Whitehead might mean, that which is not yet but might be, some mode of coherence which might have a chance at every scale, until the stories start getting told like that, and until those who tell the news start hearing where those bits of story are actually being told, where people are actually doing this, but they're not on the news. Maybe just a little bit, maybe very weak. How to make the weak stories stronger and the strong stories weaker. We are speechless to this now, and then we give it bad names. But good thinking always happens at the moment of speechlessness. As a proper Catholic kid who grew up with, reading Thomas Aquinas and Anselm, and, I had these doubts about faith, and so I was told to read all this stuff when I was 13 and 14. You don't understand a word. What? You have no idea what you're reading. The mystics and the Thomas Aquinas. Come on, give me a break. You have no idea, but it fucks with your mind. It changes who you are, right? And so I, from early on, baby Catholic on, teenage Catholic on, I knew that the minute you start reciting the names of God, you are an idolater. The minute you think you have a positive name, you have become an idolater. You have told a very particular kind of lie, the biggest kind of lie, and that the only truth that can be told must at its most fundamental level be the failure of naming. It's the failure of giving positive names. It's at that moment of failure that there is some encounter with it, whatever it is, something that's not a lie. And the minute you name it God, you're an idolater. So worshippers of God are idolaters. And yet, the only way to come to grips, to come into the presence of it, say the important mystics that shaped my little 13-year-old screwed up mind. The only way to come into the presence of it is to constantly keep doing positive things. You have to keep trying to make an experiment work. You have to constantly keep writing this particular story, not some story in general, but this story. You have to do this. You have to be here, not everywhere. You have to be attached to some things, not everything. The only possible way is again and again and again we engage each other in doing something. Okay?
Okay.
You don't even have your back brace. All right, those with stamina continue. Those without stamina take a break. But I don't have the choice. We don't have the choice. Anthropocene is in play. It's a good enough word. Does a lot of work. Good enough work. Tough for me. Whatever. So I would have done it differently. Too bad. Who cares? I mean, truly, who cares? We work with what we've got. And there really are places to work where that terminology and that apparatus and those modelings are really important. Even though it's made to be too big and too important, it's always a story. These stories, Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Nyannyasene, they always threaten to become too big. And as soon as they become too big, they act like they take over everything. Okay? And if you're going to change the story, you can't do that. So even, I propose the Thulucene. Well, of course, that's in a way a joke, because that threatens to be too big too. So Isabel here is giving me this provocation. She and Philip Piñar and others, she is really worried about the way that capitalism and the critique of capitalism and the critique of capital makes us stupid, and makes us stupid in a particular way. It makes us believe there is nothing else possible in the world. The kind of stupidity that comes from constantly repeating the ever newer, ever smarter, up to the minute, latest version of the critique of capital, the smartest possible, really good, the Marxism that I really am not going to let go of, and I refuse to let Bruno say that we don't need it. I think we do need our Marxism and a lot of other things too. But how to make it be part of what is added to the cat's cradle in a smart way? Because the stupid thing is to be so mesmerized by the smartness of the latest analysis of capital, that we lose all sense that what is really important in the world, and the only reason to do this analytical work, is to learn how to tell another story and to learn how to add to the work of those who are already storying otherwise. The only possible thing to do in the world as we are inhabiting is to revolt. It's like Emily Carr. It's like it's an insurrection, okay? And it's an insurrection that refuses the paralysis of critique, that the world is finished because we know how it works. And you're stupid because you don't know how it works, and you're just an activist, or you're just a witch, or you're just a something. You just believe in all these stupid things. You're a Christian, you're really stupid. You're a Muslim, you're really stupid. You're a pagan, you're really stupid. We know how the world really works. That kind of arrogance, which is the arrogance of the scholars, the arrogance of the intellectuals. Our poison is that with which we poison the very thing we think we're doing. We think we're contributing to building a different story, and we're feeding it poison by our own relentless being smarter than everybody else with the latest version of our theory. We do have to practice war. We do have to be for some worlds and not others. We are against some ways of doing the world. We are truly against building the Keystone Pipeline and sucking the earth dry of fossil fuels and many other things. It is really important to be in revolt. So for some ways of life and not others is a kind of war of the worlds, but it's a war of the worlds as a part of the proposition of peace, of the risky proposition. So I think that there is a shift. There is, of course, a shift in the world in that we have a little time. We, whatever this we is, we are living in a period of time, short, long, I don't know. It's not instantaneous, but it's maybe not long. There is a little time to make a difference. Maybe not very much. After which the consequences of what we have provoked, not just we in the human sense, but significantly, I don't know, it's not the anthropos. I really do think it's not only capitalism, of course. Of course it's not only capitalism, but wow, if we could have only one name, the last 500 years of sucking the earth dry in the form of resourcing it for extraction as wealth in the form of capital. It's a pretty good analysis, of what these last 500 years have done to this earth. And we have a little time we inherit the consequences, and we have a while to see if peace is possible. One's whole life is in the work, in the writing, in the play. And my life has involved intense, good family. A family with whom I've reproductive family, fathers, brothers, mothers, cousins, and so forth, with whom I feel very strong connection. So it's not about something negative in that regard. But my life, my adult life especially, but from kind of early, I don't know, almost as early as I can imagine. I remember my mother worrying that I wasn't marriageable for some odd reason. There was a non-fittingness into heteronormativity for me from childhood. I don't know why, it just was. I had 21 dolls, and most of them had polio or were in iron lungs, or, I had I had a relationship to femininity that was probably not all that unusual. That was both and, neither nor, all of the above, none of the above kind of thing. And I think in my adult life, Jay, who was a fellow graduate student at Yale University, he was in the history department, and I came to be intensely engaged with each other as friends and lovers, with no model for how to handle that except marriage. I knew Jay was gay. There was never any secret about that. For some reason, it didn't activate jealousy, or I don't know why. There was a way in which Jay and I, for our own reasons, needed to be married, but somehow marriage was seriously the wrong model for what we were doing. It was a kind of brother-sister sexuality, that incest is the wrong name too, because that connotes some kind of violation, and it wasn't. And that kind of accreting, making family by making homes, that making kin, making kind. And this was, of course, a period of history where lots of people are experimenting with forms of social and sexual life. Communes of all kinds, love relationships of all kinds. Heteronormative marriage was an object of ridicule and critique. That helps a lot, in one's own explorations. And, Jay's lover, Bob, my lover and husband and friend, Rustin, joined. I mean, we got officially divorced, but we could never figure out who got the camera. We couldn't split the property. I don't know. We had a sewing machine and a camera. I'm being facetious. Point is, whatever it was that we did was for life, and in ways that we had no particular models for, except that a lot of people at that moment in history were finding ways of living for which there were no particular models. And in retrospect, it wasn't all that radical or anything, but it never resolved into the reproductive heteronormative family as a model for a good life. And so our relationships with Susan and Marco Harding, our godson and good friend Susan, is an extended kin relationship that is way more, in significant way, we are extended kin to each other in some ways, legally with things we've done with various instruments, but mostly it's that insistence on living that way. And Jay and Bob both died of AIDS. Bob in 1986 and Jay in 1991. They were among the early people who fell to that fire that swept their generation of gay men, and of course continues to sweep, cut a wide swath among the peoples of the world, even though it's manageable as a chronic disease now with the drug cocktails and the rest. It affects tens of millions of people. It's a big deal, and it touched us intimately at the heart of our family. And Jay's mother, Maxine, conventional, conservative Christian woman, so on and so forth. She introduces Rustin and me as her daughter-in-law and her son-in-law. This religious, apartment complex. They just look like, what? You really can't figure this out. Maxine doesn't even know she's saying that. So making kin, making family with each other without the imperative of biological reproduction, and indeed with quite something else, with a kind of cultivating the responsibility to be part of moving the population of this earth to more tolerable levels, and starting in the rich countries, obviously. So, and then, as you point out with Cain, it's more than a joke. We are kin with more than other human beings. We make our households, our families, our worldings with a host of other critters. And that cobbling together connections that really matter, may as well call them kin, making kinships. And the question is not so much who you go to bed with, although that of course matters at certain key points in one's life, but the ways one builds the lifetime kin. I would love to see certain kinds of institutional apparatuses, like being able much more easily to adopt adults, to build legally protected family, to be engaged in city planning and architecture, and to be engaged in the building of rituals that celebrate adulthood, with adulthood that involves the decision not to have a child, how to celebrate that as opposed to regard it as a tragedy, while celebrating children too. It's that kind of needing to build a non-heteronormative joy in these kinds of lives. So yeah, it's a lifetime commitment, for sure.
Finish finally this green screen shooting.
Okay, end of green screen.
One kind of
Hey, we get,
object.
oh good, holes in being at last. I get it. Yay!
All for you.
Oh yes! I can have a third eye. I don't know what's happening here. Yes, this is excellent. I have more green things out there if you bring them in.
Okay. Let's search the big board.
The big ball's in the bedroom. It's over. It's in the corner of the bedroom. Yeah, and we have. This is. Yeah, or maybe this is. Oh, I don't know. This is the egg you laid. I'm sorry. There we go.
Okay. I think this is not bad.
It laid an egg.
Please.
Okay. This is, yeah, there we go. Okay. So, there we go. Now we're really done.
Thank you.
How's that for the end? Early in the 21st century, communities all over the planet sensed a kind of urgency of the undoing of ways of living and dying. An undoing that involved humans and other critters in the tissues of our being together on Earth itself. Somehow, a kind of wave of feeling and action and thinking and motion began to sweep the earth in a very particular sense. Communities of 150 to 500 people began to form with each other, either from already being in place, but finding each other and coming together with intensities that were practiced in quite new ways, or moving from one place to another. All of these communities formed themselves around a particular kind of felt intensity, a felt need and lust and desire and project, which was to live for the recuperation of the critters of the earth, the human and the non-human. to somehow cultivate the arts of living on a damaged planet, to be those who came to recuperate and restore where they could as communities who either already lived or moved to damaged lands to be communities of care and concern. Camille One was born in a community that had decided that at least 3 parents were going to be required for every new baby. And having a baby was not something someone could just decide to do. It was rather a collective decision, so that folks who wanted to bear babies or bring babies into the world might well have to wait or might never be able to do so, but they could participate as parents in a family raising a baby. So that Camille One was going to have siblings. Not necessarily in the same immediate household, but the children to be born in this community had to have other children who were going to be their siblings, but who were almost certainly not going to be their biological siblings. So the reproductive choice for the person who would bear the pregnancy, whether that person was a male or a female person in the beginning of this process, whoever bore the pregnancy to birthing had a particular kind of reproductive choice, which was to choose a symbiont, another critter who was to be in symbiosis with the human baby for the lifetime of that baby. So the woman who bore Camille One, in a dream that she had during her pregnancy, chose for Camille One the symbiont of the monarch butterfly. The monarch butterflies had part of their range in the area where this community had settled down. Camille One at puberty could do many things. Camille One could decide to alter its body into male or female or other ways. Camille One could choose to stay with whatever body it was birthed with, could partially alter, maybe a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and some of it was going to be irreversible. They'd have to learn to live with consequences. The community was not afraid of a kind of morphological experimentation and thought that that was something that adolescents ought to have the means to do. Camille One chose to stay with the symbiosis and to deepen it. And the story begins with the first heir of Camille One, Camille Two. Camille Two was born female, and as an adolescent, Camille Two decided to stay female, but wanted to grow a beard. In Camille One's lifetime, the symbiotic relationships were not yet at a molecular level. Biological sciences, the technobiological sciences of the community had developed in such a way that by the time Camille Two was born, it was possible and indeed desirable in the community for the symbionts and the human beings to share bodily substance and to share genetic substance. So at puberty, Camille Two decided to have implanted on her face a beard made up of the stem cells that would grow the antennae of butterflies. So that Camille Two had a face full of the antennae of butterflies. And the antennae could sense, could taste the air, taste the foods. And Camille Two had an enhanced sensory being that she, felt enhanced Z's ability to care for and to care about the ongoing possibilities of the monarchs. By Camille II's generation, the kids were doing skin implants of stem cells to build patterns on their skin that were the patterns of the insects and the critters that they were taking care of. So they would do, their dance raves and drug scenes and all the rest. They had various kinds of light shows and really, some of the ones that were symbiotically banded to the octopus and the squid had the chromatophores in their skin. So when they got sexually excited, they would pulse the same way that the squid and the cuttlefish and the octopus would pulse. They could do these amazing light shows with their skin. So there was a kind of playfulness around this caring. Just as making kin without making babies was a lifetime matter, this question of forming and reforming kin was not something done all at once. You didn't inherit everything all at once. Frequently, adoptions would take place of people in their 50s. Families would form and reform and perhaps redo their houses and rewrite their instruments of financial joint responsibility. It was understood that making family was a lifetime matter and that families needed to be able to experiment and change. The commitments were very serious and intended to be for a lifetime, but it could take various forms. It was understood that you needed rituals and support, ways of celebrating the breaking up of love affairs and the consolidation of friendships out of love affairs that had broken. Of course, there were terrible mistakes made. It was understood that there would be a lot of suffering in this. But the communities felt that they were the children of compost. They were staying with the trouble. They were here to somehow build the cat's cradle games that would make flourishing, ongoing possible.